Welcome back to the Whole Person Revolution. It has been a little while as Comment magazine has been taking the last month of summer to transition out of all things social change, which occupied a lot of our focus for much of 2023, to pivot now towards a notoriously fraught subject, namely gender. That brave new issue is officially out and about in the world, and I'm here, the editor-in-chief of Comment and your usual host, Ann Snyder, with a twist. I figured it would be unfair to conduct a conversation on all things male and female as a woman by myself, so I'm bringing in one of my wise compatriots on Comment's editorial team, and his name is Jeff Reimer. Jeff is joining me virtually from his home outside of Wichita, Kansas. And as I have said publicly before and maintain now, he is an unusual combo of wry and wholesome, cleverness, yet also humility. We've been colleagues for several years now, and it is no exaggeration to say that his red pen on my drafts have only made my thinking sharper. All you guys that get frustrated with my mixed metaphors and long, way overly dense sentences, well, you can thank Jeff here for disciplining my joy. We don't always agree, and we argue through our differences in prose style and cultural priors with some regularity, but I hope at least that all of that sits on a bedrock of earned mutual respect. And honestly, I'm just very grateful to have such a good-hearted and clear-eyed colleague helping me produce this conversation called Comment. So Jeff, welcome. Pull up a chair. Are you ready to have some fun with this sucker?
Thanks, Ann. Yep, I'm ready.
Okay. So, we're about to welcome Richard Reeves and Christine Emba to the studio here, two very thoughtful people, I would say, who have spent more time recently studying what many are calling a, quote, crisis in masculinity, and we'll have them come in soon. But before we do, Jeff, I just wanted you and I to take a second, partly just to introduce our own friendship and collegiality to our listeners. We've been steeped in this conversation as an editorial team for many months, as is natural for a quarterly publication, as we've been working with our authors and trying to frame it properly. And this whole issue of masculinity, I confess, if someone asked me publicly, well, what's your definition of masculinity? I kind of want to hide and run far away. Feels like there's just something about the public eye on this one that wants to trap a person into a kind of like pharisaical drawing of lines and then whip them if anything gets too normative or prescriptive. So it's weird because I was thinking about this back in the day, and I was coming of age and starting to have my own thoughts and opinions out of childhood. I would talk with girlfriends in particular about okay, what is, why are good men hard to find? So what is a man? And, and in that we would often paint different portraits that would probably all be various definitions around, quote, masculinity, but just to define it in a public setting, it just feels unpleasant and dangerous. So I'm wondering, why do you think this is?
Well, I think one of the things that came up in our issue over and over again was that whatever direction the public conversation goes, femininity and womanhood is sort of grounded in biology and grounded in our physical experience of the world. And so, it stands to reason that masculinity is the same way. Everybody's experience is a little different. And, one of the things, we'll talk about this with Christine, there are definite differences in how we exist and confront the world, but they overlap. The distributions are different, I think, is the way that both Richard and Christine have put it in their writing.
Yeah.
And so when I think of public expressions and definitions of masculinity that are sort of prescriptive in a larger scale way, when I think about the sort of public culture war definitions, I sort of want to drill down on this. My temperament is conservative, so I want to drill down on these traditional sort of definitions. But then when I think of my own personal experience of the world, I don't fit a lot of those. Especially living kind of in central Kansas, where masculinity is often driven by sort of ability to work with your hands and to be good with farm implements and that kind of working with your body and making a living by using it that way. And I just don't do that. So I found myself caught between these two.
Yeah.
So it seems like a good place to start, like you're saying, is with your own experience, with your own family, even though that has public implications. And even though that will likely distribute differently along the genders, probably in some kind of predictable way.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. And we've talked about this, I think, together, and you've actually written about it. But as I think about you specifically, and you've been articulate about this on a lot of different metrics, forgetting even gender, you're kind of on the edge of the inside of a lot of different worlds. And I feel like often trying to translate worlds that have given birth to your own formation, but within those worlds don't also feel like you totally fit in either. And I think that's probably true for all of us in some sense. I remember vividly, I went to a school, for undergrad, Wheaton College in Illinois. And I used to joke that by my senior year, and listeners will probably know this, but Wheaton is a Christian liberal arts school, fairly academically rigorous. So everyone's always like triply meta and a little cynical about our own community of faith. And it just kind of happens as soon as you start getting theologically educated.
Yeah.
But I remember I felt like by the end of my time there, the commonality of a Wheaton person, a Wheaton student, was that all of us said in various settings, often colloquially, sometimes formally, we would all say, "Oh, I'm not a typical Wheatie. I'm not a typical Wheaton student." And you can chalk that up to the vice of pride and the desire to be different for different sake. But I think there is something in sort of as we're trying to get into zeitgeist, we don't want to be essentialist about a vibe or a character, which maleness or femaleness or being Midwestern or being an elite or whatever, these kind of sociological categories. I think a lot of us, we analyze them from this position of sort of understanding that there are perhaps some slant ways to define an actual spine of it. And yet none of us, I think just as almost a matter of human dignity, we don't want to get completely subsumed in it. Mm-hmm. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's supposed to be a way of describing your experience of the world, not a way of constraining it.
Right. Well said. Maybe a safe way, or an initially safe way to get into this whole conversation about masculinity specifically, and with hopefully a bit of a wink. When you think of models of masculinity in film, do any movies and or characters come to mind as being oh yeah, that was gutturally masculine when I watched that?
Yeah. Well, kind of two somewhat contrasting examples come to mind. And first is pretty predictable, but because I'll just say it. Brad Pitt's character in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is just this archetypal sort of masculine guy. He's self-possessed. He's strong. He doesn't care what others think of him. He's kind of got a bit role in Hollywood, and he's okay with that. And so, that's one. And the sort of archetypally masculine guy who, I think in a good way, he sort of saves the day in the end. So the contrast with Brad Pitt is, have you seen the movie Scott Pilgrim versus the World?
I have heard the title. I've not seen it. No.
It's a very silly movie, but I love it. I absolutely love it. And the main character is played by Michael Cera, who is the diametric opposite of Brad Pitt as a physical person, right? He's sort of kind of effeminate. He's kind of squishy and high voice, but through the course of that movie, he sort of learns to take responsibility for the damage he leaves in his wake, as a sort of almost like a passively predatory male. He's got a string of girlfriends in his past that are hurt by him, and he has not realized that he's hurt them, and he has to take responsibility for that damage he's caused before he's able to move on and to get the girl and whatever. And so at a key moment at the end of the movie, it's sort of video game themed, and he gets a power up for the power of love, and then it doesn't really work. And so he does it again, and he gets the power up of the power of self-respect.
Oh, wow.
And then he's able to defeat the villain. And it's a really great picture of somebody who he's not aggressive per se in a really typically masculine way, but he does nevertheless harm people through his actions, and he has to confront that part of himself before he's able to fully realize who he is.
Oh, that's very, very good. What is it called? Scott Pilgrim
versus the World. It's a very millennial movie. It's bizarre, but I love it. I love it.
Christine, Richard, hello. It's good to see you as always. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Hi.
Listeners, a little background on our esteemed guest before we get into this. Christine Emba is an opinion columnist and editor for the Washington Post, the author of quite a show-stopping book with a beautiful cover called Rethinking Sex, A Provocation. And I say this with gratitude, a highly generative contributing editor to our own Comment magazine. Most recently, Christine wrote a much talked about essay in the Post titled Men Are Lost. Here's a Map Out of the Wilderness. We'll link to it in the show notes and flesh it out here in this conversation. But if I may, I just want to draw out two awesome categories that I feel like, Christine, you coined. Maybe you didn't, but I'm going to say you did. I just can't stop smiling about them. These are fun words to say, even if many of them highlight a more disturbing set of trend lines. And I just want to say them here. The manosphere and mansplainers. And I just want you to throw those in every other sentence in this conversation because I think they're so perfect. Richard Reeves is president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, an organization he has bravely founded and is just now getting off the ground to what I hear, frankly, all over the ideological spectrum is very high anticipation. And I just think an unusual cross-section of grateful stakeholders. So I think we're all watching you with admiration and anticipation. No pressure, Richard. And he is founding this institute after spending many years at the Brookings Institute as a senior fellow in economic studies. Richard is the author, most recently, of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. That's published in 2022. And then in 2017, he published Dream Hoarders, How the American Upper Middle Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, Why That is a Problem, and What to Do About It. And I wouldn't be shocked if between those 5 years, those two books in weird ways talk to each other, actually quite interestingly. He's also the author of John Stuart Mill, Victorian Firebrand, an intellectual biography of the British liberal philosopher and politician. And as you might imagine from these, he contributes to a wide range of publications. So we're just really grateful to have you. Richard has blessed Comment with a wonderful essay in the issue just out in Gender, and we're also going to highlight that in the show notes, and that's titled What Men Are For, When Lone Ranger Masculinity Bottoms Out. So thank you both for coming here. There's a lot to talk about. I'm just going to begin, and then Jeff's going to, we'll have this yin and yang here. We just kind of want to know, how did you both become interested in the question of boys and men and masculinity broadly? Christine, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think it's been a long generating interest, actually. So I think I first began to dip a toe into the topic in perhaps around 2018 when I heard about this YouTube influencer who had suddenly gotten big. It was Jordan Peterson. And I went to a Jordan Peterson book tour stop in DC and was just fascinated and kind of worried by how popular he was, but also how specific his audience was. The audience at this reading was probably 85% men, which was something I'd never really seen before for just a book tour stop. It was also around the time when incels were entering the news, unfortunately for murdering women. And, I kind of began to think, what is happening? What is happening with all of these men? And of course, this also, I think, coincided with the fact that I was and am a young woman in DC who is also trying to meet and perhaps date men. And we'll talk about it.
What's that?
Yeah, fresh stuff. But, was talking about this with with female friends, spent time thinking about this a lot in the course of writing Rethinking Sex. And there was a constant complaint that there was just something off with guys today. There were no good men to be found. And then when we would speak to men and when I interviewed men for Rethinking Sex, there was this generalized sense of confusion, especially after Me Too, a sort of, well, what, I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to be. Should I talk to women? Am I not allowed to talk to women? What should I do? And I was just fascinated and alarmed by this sort of confluence of weirdness that was going on with men and seems to have only increased over the past several years.
Yeah, very much so. Richard, I assume all that resonates deeply. Why now?
Well, that's the right question. Why now? I've been thinking and living some of these issues for a very long time. I actually discovered recently that the very first article I ever wrote for publication was entitled Fathers Are Parents Too. And it was an argument about fatherhood. And that was even before I became a father myself. And so I've raised 3 boys, all now in their 20s. And so I come at it with that experience. But what really happened to me, in a way, what's interesting about this is I think my starting point was almost the opposite to Christine's, but then I think we meet in an interesting space. I come at this as a social scientist and someone studying class and economic opportunity and education and mobility. And I just kept stumbling across all these facts about the problems that many boys and men were having in society, just in the data, that I didn't think were getting very much attention. And the more I looked at that, the more I wondered how we were talking about those issues. And in my view, we weren't talking about them, or we weren't talking about them very well, or the only people we're talking about them were people like Jordan Peterson, who actually were raising some of those issues and either being, dismissed or lauded, depending on your point of view, for doing so. And then I believe that the cultural issues that in some ways ground zero for which are the dating issues that Christine's talked about, that's where some of those chickens come home to roost. So I came at it very much as a wonk, as a policy person, as a, why are we not paying attention to the fact that there's a massive gender gap on colleges? Why are we not worrying more about some of these issues for boys and men? Why are we not paying more attention to the mental health issues? So I came at it with sort of facts. And then, of course, I'd be discussing them with my boys over the dinner table. And they'd be talking about some of the stuff that Christine's talking about in their schools and toxic masculinity and Andrew Tate, who is the manfluencer, which I think is Christine's real contribution to this
Thank you, Richard.
lexicon, by the way. I'm pretty sure that's Christine's. And Andrew Tate makes Jordan Peterson look like this twinkly, friendly uncle figure by comparison. And so to some extent, the debate's moved on even the last few years. But that's the sort of different approach that I brought to this, and that's what led me to read the book and do all the other stuff I'm doing now.
Thanks, Richard. I am laughing thinking of you entering this conversation as a wonk, but with what you're saying, I'm like, I wonder now how many online dating sites are wanting you to be their guru.
Oh, fascinating.
Which is probably not what you want to be your vocational future.
I do get asked about dating sometimes, and I say, I'm 54. I was raised in the UK. I've been married for 25 years. I remember sending my first email. I'm not the right person.
The times have changed, and not for the better, I have to say.
So as sort of a follow-up to that question for both of you, and a little more personal, what was your experience of masculinity growing up? Richard, you talked about it in your article some as with your dad being a pretty positive experience. Did you want others to be able to have the kind of experience you have, but updated for the new world, or what was going on in your past that informed how you have written about these things now?
Yes. What I've discovered is that, of course, I'm looking back to uncover some of the messages about masculinity, and in particular, relational masculinity, which is what I really talk about in the piece for you. that was just abundant in my own upbringing. My father in his role as a kind of provisioner and carer for us as a family, and I tell some of the stories of the sacrifices that he made as a father, which I didn't even think about. But more broadly than that, if I think about the male teachers that were in my life, and the ones that really made an impression were the ones that were doing stuff after school. Actually, it was the after school activities that it was doing stuff. Right, whether that was a sports thing or a sailing thing or a debate thing or a, whatever the club was, it was just there was a doingness about it. Doing stuff together was broadly what was the message I got about masculinity growing. Same, I was in the Boy Scouts movement, same thing, doing stuff, but never once do I remember ever having a discussion about masculinity, ever. I don't know when I first encountered the word, but the idea that we would have discussed masculinity is just unthinkable to me back then. It was something that was shown, not told. It was something that was done, not talked about. And to some extent, I'm torn about the value of making it something that we talk about and have a script for. And, no, this is how to be a man. And so, because as I say in the piece, like, people believe their eyes, not their ears. And that's especially true, I think, of boys and young men. But I definitely had that strong sense of just this doingness, relationalness from men. Like, the men who I was involved in, they were just highly engaged in family life, community life. And I contrast that in the piece with what I think Anne and I came up together with, this idea of Lone Ranger masculinity. There is this movement in the manosphere. So I'll use the term for you, man, of like men going their own way, book towels, or sort of separating themselves off from society. And as I say in the piece, that's just incredibly dangerous and anthropologically false. To the extent that we know anything about how masculinity is defined, it has to be defined relationally. It has to be defined in community, because men generate surpluses that help communities and families, right? That's what they do. So the idea of kind of the going your own way masculinity is just almost a contradiction in terms, but it flies in the face of some of our stereotypes.
One of the things that I thought of when I read that part of the essay, and I agree with you, but isn't there an aspect of sort of even the masculine provider where he needs to go out on his own, if only to retrieve provisions from the wild to come back? Isn't there some sort of like archetype to that, at least as a dynamic, if not a solitary wanderer, but somebody who goes out into the world, gets things, provides for his family, comes back to them?
I'll just jump in here. Similarly, I think I never really talked about masculinity growing up or as a child, but both of my parents are Nigerian immigrants, and in like our culture, in Igbo culture, like the gender roles are very clearly defined. And, there are archetypes of sort of like the warrior and the chief. And then I also grew up in the South. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, where, it was very normal for men to go hunting and fishing and like do man stuff. And women went to cotillion with men, actually. But like those roles are always pretty clearly demarcated for me. And it's only like looking back now that I've noticed that, especially maybe in the past 5 to 10 years, have I been introduced to a sort of like, well, like men should be softer and less overtly masculine. Like that was almost, it almost feels like having moved to DC and like a sort of liberal blue state progressive culture, that's almost new to me. But to your question, Jeff, when I asked readers of my essay about, their ideal man or their ideal of masculinity, and when I, tried to look at sort of archetypes of masculinity and how masculinity is formed or defined, especially for young men, almost everyone brings up a sort of an initiation period for men, especially young men, where they're sort of like taught to be men and then sent out into the wilderness and kind of have to fend for themselves and find their way back. So there does seem to be an aspect of, you at least have to, maybe you should be relational, you should be bringing something back for your tribe, for your family, but you should be able to be self-reliant and stand on your own 2 feet and not depend on other people. But when you go out, you're expected to come back. you don't go out, exploring and just stay there forever. A chief or a warrior will go fight, and then they'll bring back their findings for their tribe and for their family. There is an emphasis on self-reliance and self-mastery, and yes, being the individual self, but it's still in service to something larger, ideally other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say actually, I'm reminded a personal story is provoked by that, which is I do remember one of the badges that we got as a scout required you to hike in to the wilderness. I mean, I say wilderness. This was in the UK, so let's be clear. It's a wood somewhere, and then spend the night on your own and make a fire and make a bivouac. I think you weren't allowed to take almost anything with you, and then you came back out and you got the badge. But I think as a general proposition, this idea that generally men would go out on their own, starting back with your question, Jeff, it's just, I just think that's not true, is it? I mean, actually, men ancestrally, men who went out on their own would probably die. They went out together. So it may be that the men went out to kind of hunt and so on too, but that isn't that our big evolutionary advantage, is that we do it as a team, not individually. So even when men are going out to hunt, they're doing it with other men, and then they're bringing it back and sharing it. So that's the thing I think is kind of missing from some of this. I'm very interested in this idea of kind of like being on your own. I think that's quite a modern idea. I mean, maybe I don't know where it comes from.
Very American too. I mean, you think about like the Westerns and all the films that kind of give us these archetypes of that hero's journey that is solitary. It feels very American. You had a very interesting line in your Washington Post piece, Christine. You just say, and you don't really expand on it. You say, worrying about the state of our men is an American tradition. And I thought that was very astute. And I'm wondering how you came to that. I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, it is worrying about the state of men as almost a synecdoche for the state of our country is a very American thing to do, and it's almost every 50 years or so someone in American history comes out with a warning, a broadside about how men are failing. So I talk about as early as 1835, Washington Irving was lamenting how the brand new American upper class basically was, and I quote, sending our youth abroad to grow luxurious and effeminate in Europe. So already men were apparently falling apart in 1835. And then there's a recurring discussion that happens in 1920, after the Great Depression, where it's men are weak and they're falling apart, and this became an obsession with physical fitness. And then, in 1958, after World War II, which was
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, it was felt that men sort of proved themselves in the wars, and then after the wars, they'd grown fat and lazy, and the male role was unclear, and so you had figures like Teddy Roosevelt, who created these sort of very visible archetypes of masculinity. The thing about this current moment, though, is that it's not just sort of a psychological worry. It feels, as Richard has shown very clearly, there's real data that shows that men are in a crisis in a way that's different than in the past. Men are, killing themselves and dying at alarming rates. 3 out of every 4 deaths of despair, which are deaths by suicide, alcoholism, or drug overdose, are men. Men are detaching from the labor market, and the biggest drop in employment is among young men between 25 and 34, I believe, which is prime working age. Men are falling behind in education. So now the crisis, which is talked about always, is real.
I'm wondering what is going on. This notion that masculinity is better caught than taught, which I think is also true for femininity, but the modes of that showing and telling is quite different. What's going on that the showing, not telling, is no longer working? Do we just fall back to what I often fall back to, which is like an erosion in our social fabric, loss of proximate models, where frankly, there's like love and formation. I mean, I'm curious, what is, I'm thinking about technology, like why is the modeling either not happening or not working?
Well, I just want to underline this point that both you and Christine have made about this question of the cultural fragility of masculinity issue. And I'm just wondering out loud here a little bit about the extent to which the self-consciousness about that you see in the US actually maybe that's part of being a slightly younger culture. So obviously this is me thinking about this as a sort of new American, as a European too. It's just like, I think some of the same things can be said about class and status and manners, and just to some extent, US is just a younger culture, and therefore maybe somewhat more self-conscious about the elements of that culture. It's just a supposition to kind of put out there. It may not just be masculinity, it may be other aspects of US culture that feel a little bit more like we're still working them out. And maybe the frontier, as Christine mentioned, is part of that. But as far as this caught not taught thing that we've talked about a bit already, I think there's a growing suspicion of some of the spaces and ways in which that showing was done historically. I mean, Christine and I both talked about the lack of male teachers, the lack of male coaches, the fact that the Boy Scout movement has gone co-ed, right? Controversially, actually. So those are kind of interesting moments. Most churches have fewer men in them than women, and of course, there's more secularization anyway. So just if you think about, I was just talking to some people in fraternities, and I have very mixed feelings about fraternities for sure. But just there's this sense of like, well, who and where is that modeling going to take place? And increasingly, there's a suspicion of particularly of male-only spaces, where that might, or male-only activities. I remember saying to a friend of mine at Brookings that I was going away for a weekend with my male friends. We go hiking once a year and, talk stuff. And she said, "Oh, I hate that." I said, "Why?" She said, "Oh, just like, men excluding women." I said, "Well, we weren't really excluding women. It was just, the thing we do as guys." She said, "Well, are there any women coming?" I said, "Well, no, but that would defeat the point of it. What's the point of it?" Well, it's just really hard to explain to a kind of, that was a sort of middle-aged feminist, like why it was a good idea that men went away for a weekend together, whereas she saw it as threatening and patriarchal and backward-looking and so on. So the very idea that there should be spaces and activities that are for men, as there are for women, by the way, has become really suspect in many parts of our culture.
I think that especially among older women and older feminists who have really had to sort of fight for female inclusion in the workplace and in other spaces, it's really easy and a close memory to think of male-only spaces as being the spaces where power is passed and where those women were purposefully excluded. You work at a law firm and all of your male colleagues go out golfing and they share all their trade secrets and promote each other, and you're just left out. And there's this fear that anywhere men are gathering together somehow, like there's some action happening and women don't get to be part of it. And it's not seen as just like, oh, they're out there like having fun with their bro friends. It's like they must be trading secrets and keeping that power away from us. But in this moment, not all men actually have that much more power than women. Many still do, especially in really high spaces, in Congress and in CEOships. But I think that suspicion is maybe a little bit out of date, but still informs how a certain generation of women thinks about men gathering alone. But I think this question is really important, Anne. The idea of role modeling and seeing and not telling. There's this cliche, right, that men communicate side by side and women talk face to face, and it's in some ways a cliche, maybe because it's a little bit true. One of the biggest pushbacks to my piece that I've gotten from men, especially, is that like this is sort of therapeutic culture. Like no men are sitting around talking about how to be men together. They just like go out and are men together. And the fact that we have to that women have to write long articles about it, and that is women writing the articles, because like, why would a man do that? Is stuff to do. That was an interesting take. But also, one of the things that came up a lot in the research for my piece and in the interviews that I did with young men especially was, yes, actually just very specifically a lack of role models in their lives. One young man I talked to was like, My father kind of sucked, and he wasn't a good male role model. We weren't close, and then he died. And I can count on on the 5 fingers of my hand, the number of friends I know who have good relationships with their fathers. We just don't have men in our lives, really. And so where do you go? Who do you follow to learn? And he talked about how he had met a priest in his community who became sort of a male mentor figure for him, who took him under his wing. And he had also told me about how, he was a grad student at an Ivy League university, how like younger students were kind of coming up to him and asking him for mentorship and advice because they didn't have role models themselves. But it seems like there is a decline in just like the family formation, the decline of fathers in the home, and even father figures in the community, whether your father or not. And yes, a lack of male teachers in schools. And also, I think this is probably the falling apart of broader community. Even if you didn't have a father in the home, perhaps, 50 years ago, you might still be part of a church where there were men around who you could learn from and speak to or work side by side with. Or maybe you didn't have a good father figure at home, but you joined your Elks Lodge or your Rotary Club, and you could still meet men of an older generation or even men of your own generation and spend time with them and sort of absorb manhood and masculinity in that way. But, today we don't gather in that way. Today we spend a lot of our time alone online, and you find male role models on YouTube, the Jordan Petersons and Andrew Tates, but they're not real. They're not actually a part of your life, and that's a problem.
Yeah, one of the criticisms I see again and again of Jordan Peterson is that his books aren't actually very insightful. Like they're just really basic advice, and I think that is exactly why they are so successful.
Mm-hmm.
Like they tell you how to do the things that should be just part of your upbringing, and somebody with authority tells them, "Here's what you should do to be a man," and they're like, "Oh, okay, well that sounds really basic, but also very helpful."
Yeah.
So yeah, we're having to like sort of jimmy up these traditional kind of arrangements in new and ad hoc ways.
Right. Jordan Peterson's one of his most famous bits of advice is clean your room. And it's like, shouldn't your dad have told you that? And yes, actually, but a lot of people don't have a dad to tell them that.
Yeah. And that seems to be the one chapter of his book that my boys managed to miss when they were reading it.
They're working on it. They're still developing their masculinity.
Still hope.
Like I just need one rule for life. That's the one I wanted. No.
Christine, you're bringing this to mind just kind of for the first time. I think I've floated around this, wondering perhaps it's a good insight. I don't know yet, but I at the risk of being overly philosophical and broad, I wonder if there really is a pluralism. Or this is like a function of the challenges of pluralism, and what I mean by that is there is less attachment between the words we use to describe virtues and the fruit of character formation and the fruit of sort of relational modeling. Those like that may be happening in people's lives, that there may be modeling. They may see humility working itself out. They may see self-respect. They may see showing up on time. But this sort of like moral vocabulary around that is disaggregated. So our like moral vocabulary gets siphoned into hashtags and people like Jordan Peterson preaching on a YouTube video. And it's like words and behavior are somehow detached from one another in a way I don't think was true. I mean, I think about William James, 1911, and this is when the Boy Scouts were starting to surge in the U.S. He had this speech called The Moral Equivalent of War, very famous talk, pre-World War I. And there was this sort of, it was to your point earlier, Christine, it was very much like calling men to more, calling men to higher, but it had this like, it wasn't even like a biblical metaphysic per se, but it did have a self-confident and rich moral vocabulary tied to the call of the nation, tied to ideas of patriotism and sacrifice and so on, that paired kind of a way of being with verbal categories. And there's something detached right now in sort of like our bodies, our behavior, our private lives, what we see, and categories to understand it. And this is a crackpot theory I'm just like voicing out loud now. I don't know if there's anything to it, but I think there's something there, just to your point about how so much of our brain spaces, we awaken to things we're hearing online, which is a very like one-dimensional space of words and tone and messaging that is stripped of any like incarnate form. So this is the Christian in me talking, obviously, but
yes.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, there is obviously a Christian version of that, but there's a version of it that doesn't require that theology, which is the rhetoric is to some extent attempting to make up for the absence of relationships and roles. And maybe thinking about this kind of historically, the reason why we didn't need so much rhetoric about masculinity, certainly in the environment I grew up, was because there were just men showing masculinity in very relational ways. And there were roles for men that were very specific. And I think this is one of the, and they were being filled. Right. And so maybe absent clear relational models of masculinity all around us, maybe absent clear roles for men, and we can talk about what those should be, that actually you're kind of filling that vacuum. And that's how I see the work of people like Peterson and others, is kind of filling a vacuum. Now, it might be better than nothing, but it doesn't substitute for, well, actually the things that create that vacuum in those boys' and men's lives anyway, right? Reading a book or listening to a podcast or going to a lecture is always going to be a suboptimal approach to this, as opposed to your father, your coach, your friend, your scout leader, your neighbor, your uncle, your whoever the hell it is in your actual life, in your embodied daily life, someone who you can touch and see and feel and talk to and listen to. And so I think that one of the most conservative conclusions that I've come to as a result of my work is the need for specific roles for men, and that are labeled as such, seen as such. And that's been a real journey for me. And I'll give you one example from religion. This is from Judaism. A Jewish friend of mine said that when progressive synagogues said, well, we don't need the minyan to be all men anymore. Right? You know, the whole thing, you'd have to run around. In fact, there's stories, great stories from the Bible. It's like, you need another guy. My son works in a Jewish daycare, and sometimes, someone will run in and say, great, we need someone else for the minyan. And he's like, sorry, I'm a Gentile. Sorry. But like, they'll just grab a guy. Right. And so as soon as they said, no, it doesn't need to be men, in a lot of progressive synagogues, they became female almost overnight.
This has happened with altar servers in Catholic churches too, actually.
Same thing. We don't need the guy. You don't need to be a guy to do this. And whether we like it or not, it does seem as if that sort of socialization of male roles is more important. And it actually does need to be signaled more clearly. And so that's why the loss of roles specifically for men. So the reason I'm most worried in the end, I think, about why the Boy Scouts going co-ed is you don't need male leaders anymore. And if you start saying to men, we don't need any male scout leaders anymore, I'm exaggerating a bit for effect, then I can guarantee you'll have fewer of them. They won't show up. Men won't show up unless they know why they're showing up.
This is the genius that I see in Latter-day Saints. Years ago when I was studying character, I wandered over to Utah here and there, but just because they seemed, frankly, not to get political, but I was sort of impressed with the way they were standing apart as political conservatives, many of them in sort of the Trump era. And, famous for unusually good social capital and all the rest. And as I was spending more time in Salt Lake City getting to know Mormons and the Church of Latter-day Saints, it was fascinating to hear lay people. Obviously, they have a hierarchy, but it was fascinating to hear lay people, men and women. That's quite a gendered subculture religiously, but they each have roles. Like they describe, yes, they may be a plumber, they may run an organization, they may be president of a college, they may be a stay-at-home mom in their lives, but in the church itself, as Mormons, they have a role with a proper noun inside the church. And I always found that it's such a strong system, but I was like, but the fruit of this is interesting in like late modernity. There's something here that's working for frankly, creating like relatively peaceful, generative citizens that we want to be our neighbors. So I just think your point about roles is like vital and very central, Richard. And frankly, not just for men, but perhaps uniquely for men.
Mm. But the trick is to make them, and I think I actually take the risk of quoting Robert Bly in my piece for you, is to have those roles, but for them not to be restrictive, not to be determinative. Like, this is the whole issue, which is as soon as you start talking about, distinct roles for kind of men and women, it's like, okay, so to be a proper man, you have to do that. To be a proper woman, you have to do that. When, of course, there are going to be some women that want to do the stuff that are more traditionally male and vice versa, and that's fine. And we don't need to absolutely destroy any rule at all in order to honor the exceptions to it. And I quote Bly as saying, we should allow ourselves to use the words masculine and feminine without being afraid that some moral carpenter is going to turn up and make boxes out of them in which to trap us, because we're afraid of boxes, and rightly so. But so that's it. Can we talk about masculinity and femininity in a way that isn't overly prescriptive and therefore misses the diversity of human experience for both men and women, but which also doesn't assume that we're going to get to an androgynous future, that actually just recognizes and honors the differences? And that's the work we're all trying to do right now. But it's hard. It's hard in a world that says you've got to choose one or the other, right? Even talking about distinct roles for men and women is a perilous business, even though everything in human history suggests that we want that, but we also don't want to be trapped by it. I don't want to be determined by it. And I have 3 boys all in their 20s, and I got to tell you, they are very different in their expressions of masculinity, very different. And that's so great that they're able to do that.
So one of my questions in reading both of your work is how education, especially higher education, functions in these conversations. Because you both kind of point to the disproportion of women in higher education to men, and as a sort of a sign of something's out of balance. But what I wonder about is, and I'm a strong believer in higher education for all people. I love, especially liberal arts education. Like, that's great. But for a lot of men, I think they could do well by, and probably now make as much money working a trade as pursuing education. But how do those dynamics fit into your analysis?
Yeah, I think that's really important too, and it's kind of complicated actually. I say actually as if that's a surprise. It was always going to be kind of complicated. One of the young men I interviewed in my piece brought up the problem, what he described as the problem of credentialism in U.S. society, and especially in sort of middle and upper middle class society, as a real problem for men and a real problem for his conception of masculinity. And what he meant by that was the idea, it's a fairly newish idea, I would say, that, everyone should go to college. I feel like the push that every person should be college bound was maybe like a Clinton Obama era introduction, and that, we value people and we promote people based on their degrees and their level of education, that credentials count, that you should have a bachelor's, you should try and get a master's, you should be going as far as you can with, certificates and paper. That this was actually a massive problem for a lot of young men who maybe aren't that interested in higher education as such, in terms of, going to a 4-year college or amassing various numbers of degrees and promoting themselves that way, but could be, yes, making a lot of money, being really successful, working with their strengths in the trades or in other areas of society. But the society that they lived in would only reward men who got degrees or men who had these certain credentials, and women. And this was his real complaint, as a man living in DC, that women seemed to only value men who were credentialed, well credentialed enough, had like the right kind of job and the right kind of degree. And a lot of men weren't necessarily interested in or successful in those spheres in the same way. And so a lot of men were being cut out of social connection and social advancement because they didn't fit that actually fairly narrow mold of, college success and an Ivy League attendance, say, of gathering credentials instead of just doing work of some kind and being valued for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I agree with what Christine's just said, but I sometimes think that specific concern about dating and education and value is quite an elite concern. I think that's more true at the top of the distribution. I don't see as much evidence for it kind of in the middle. So anecdotally, I have a family member and she's a nurse and has a master's degree. He runs a really successful plumbing company himself, and I think has a plumbing certificate from a community college, and neither of them care. And I don't envisage a world anytime soon where nurses are just looking down their noses at plumbers, as long as they're doing okay, right? So I don't know, but I think at the elite that might be true. The broader question, Jeff, is that we have a now huge gender gap on college campuses in favor of women. That's only going to get, I think, wider, particularly as colleges go test optional. The main effect of going test optional is a 4-point jump in the female share. I think as the Ivies come under more scrutiny for their admissions policies, they're going to have to start taking the thumb off the scale a bit for men, which is what they're doing right now. So I think the Ivies will start trending that way too. So the question is, does that matter, right? Let's say it's 60-40, 65. Does it matter? Well, it might matter if it's an indication that there's something about the system that just isn't working as well for boys and men. And I think that is true in some cases. But it also matters if the alternatives to college that might be a bit more male-friendly aren't very good. And that's really true, right? And so for me, this is like 90% of apprenticeships are men. Apprentices are men, right? Should we expand apprenticeships? Yes. Right. And the fact that they're very male-skewed, or vocational high schools or whatever, strikes me as a feature, not a bug. We're never going to get back. We're never going to get to 50-50 in 4-year colleges. Never. Women are always going to be ahead of men from now on out. That's a strong prediction. Like, there's no way, just because they're better at some of the elements of that. But we need to make sure that there aren't things that are making that gap artificially wide, like the lack of male teachers and the pedagogies in high school. And we need to make sure the alternatives are better, and be okay with that. I'll be more and more relaxed about the gender skew towards women in higher education, traditional higher education, if we've got better alternatives for the men. But right now, the US's awful performance on non-college pathways is particularly hurting men. I think that's just a fact. And so we shouldn't obsess too much about college when there are these alternatives. Like, why is the apprenticeship bill stalled in the Senate for 2 years, right? That's just not good enough.
Well, and the thing about, college versus other career paths, and the fact that, apprenticeships and other paths towards non-college careers are poor, is that later in life, it does contribute to an income gap, where women are making more money and have more job opportunities because of their degrees, their college success, etc. And men who haven't been able to get on these sometimes vanishingly rare career tracks towards something else that is profitable are left with stagnating wages in sort of dead-ender jobs. And this contributes to unhappiness further down the line, because we do have sort of a tendency, an increasing tendency towards assortative mating. And women especially still have a tendency to want to partner with someone who makes as much as or more than they do, frankly, which still feels like an uncomfortable thing to say. And many people want to deny it, but it is in fact true. And so there becomes an asymmetry in who is able to find a partner, who is able to build a family, who ends up happy in a communal space, and who is left out. And the people who are left out because they did not have the opportunities to pursue, by virtue of not having a college degree or college completion and not having made it to one of these other paths, those are men. And I think that is only going to get worse over time. And that's something that I'm worried about.
Okay, quick final question. It's not really a quick type of answer, but so a lot of what we've been saying, we've been talking about how perilous it is to talk about these issues, and we're all spending this whole conversation trying not to get canceled. But in reading both of your work, as somebody from central Kansas, very much a red state, I think, like, say, if I gave your article, Christine, to an average churchgoer at the evangelical church I attend, they'd kind of say, like, that's great. I mean, like, you kind of got back to zero. You recognized, like, what, I don't mean that as a criticism, but if you had the sort of opposite set of concerns about who you were going to offend, like if you were going to talk to like a group of Southern Baptist pastors who already had all of their sort of the more traditional sort of gender assumptions in place, how would you reframe the problem? Or would you, if you're not trying to sort of mollify progressives, but rather a bunch of Southern Baptist pastors who aren't necessarily antagonistic, but who want to hear what you have to say, how would you say it?
Oh, that is a really interesting question. I think that the one thing that perhaps, yes, very highly churched and even religious groups haven't really come to terms with yet, or haven't fully addressed, is that their own communities, even if they talk about men or have men in the pews, may not be doing a great job actually of providing real on the ground role models for the young men in their communities. They may think that they're doing it, but in fact, those are the men who are still getting online and watching Andrew Tate and reading Bronze Age Pervert, and not listening to their pastor. And they're still embracing modes of masculinity that are wildly asocial and amoral. And the churches seem to either not be recognizing that or ignoring it for reasons that I don't completely understand. And I think also that in some ways the politicization of masculinity is contributing to these negative and antisocial forms of masculinity. When churches talk about how, feminists are destroying America and feminists are destroying the church and men need to fight them, or that men need to be warriors in the culture, they end up pushing men towards these warriors in the culture who are not very Christian role models, who are actually not good models of any sort of Christian masculinity, in service of, I guess, furthering a political cause. But it ends up having very, very negative outcomes. I think there's a lot of dialogue around masculinity, bad dialogue, negative dialogue, that is more attractive than what little pastors are putting out in their homilies and sermons. And young men are taking instruction from those flashier, more obvious, more connected models, and church leaders don't seem to be recognizing that fast enough.
I think the temptation here for churches and church leaders on this issue is in some ways a subset of the broader temptation, which I'll call the reactionary temptation. When there is, in some cases, overreach on the part of the center left or real concerns with what mainstream institutions are doing, then the temptation to become a site of reaction is huge and may even be in some ways in your interests, given that, it feels great sometimes just to rail against. They're coming after the church, they're coming after masculinity, they're coming after whatever, what the stuff, as Christine just said, they're destroying the world. And I'm actually spending quite a lot of time now, I toggle sometimes with dizzying speed between very progressive spaces and very conservative spaces. So, and most disastrously, I get it wrong, thinking that I'm speaking to one audience and it's the other. But it's also a good test, because what I find is that the things that trigger one side are the things that mollify the other side. And so if you're trying to mollify a more conservative audience, I think actually saying, look, there are differences between men and women. There are differences on average, but they're real, right? Sex is real. Sex differences are a real thing. Anyone who claims otherwise is just not speaking to the science. The term toxic masculinity is an incredibly unhelpful phrase. It's driving men away. It's not a very useful one to talk about. Men and boys really are struggling in a whole series of ways. Here's some data on that, etc. Institutions like churches and others that can provide role models for boys and men are incredibly important. You're more important than ever in terms of what? Start with that. But 40% of women earn more than the average man. 40% of breadwinners are women. Women now make up the majority on college campuses, and these are all signs of a wonderful economic liberation, right? Women's independence, women's autonomy, hard won, is a triumph for our culture. And you cannot base your view about masculinity on a roll back the clock reaction against all of that. You have got to find a way to take the best of your tradition, but fit it with the reality of women's economic independence, and not just the reality of it, but the glory of it. Right? This is a very difficult thing to do, and that's the challenge to them. So it's almost like you're doing a sort of jiu-jitsu thing, where it's like the stuff. One half of it would be like the bit you're trying to get progressives to accept. The other half is the bit of the conservatives. But in the end, the message is the same. Mm-hmm. It's the same message. It's just that like the different bits trigger the others. But like I really worry about these churches becoming, as I said, sites of reaction rather than the reform, and they have such an opportunity. Such a massive opportunity, I think, for taking the institutions and the theology of the church. And this is true for Judaism, by the way. It's also true of Islam. I mean, it is not for nothing that Andrew Tate's converted to Islam. And so there's a lot of imams now. And Christine and I actually kind of know some of these folks who are doing it. One of them's writing for me about just like what does modern Muslim masculinity look like, especially in the US context. So there's the role of religious institutions here cannot be overstated.
Yeah, there has to be a vision of positive masculinity that churches are giving out that does not involve denigrating women and denigrating femininity. One of the kind of silliest and most hilarious, but also sort of disturbing examples I've seen of this was, I think it was last year on the college campus of Notre Dame, a mom, and then her church became famous for talking about how women were wearing leggings and how these women were kind of bad and slutty and distracting men. It's like, that's not how you defend men and defend masculinity, actually, by telling, women to put on their like long denim skirts. There has to be something more than that.
Yeah, leggings are not what are destroying the American male. It's not Lycra that's doing it. I think we can all agree on that. It's a great example. I hadn't heard that story.
Christine, your phrase there has to be something more than that, honestly, like cuts to the core of our whole like animation behind this subject as a team for comment. And I think the moment in which we find ourselves as a culture, at least in the US, is like striving, like desires more, but it feels like there's just so much silencing around even the conversation. So I just want to thank you both so much for kicking off a huge onion that we'll be unpeeling for the next 7 or so episodes with other guests. Both of you, we couldn't have asked for better enunciators of this entire topic, which is, we're obviously not just focused on masculinity, but sort of all things gender as best we can. So this is really a conversation about what it means to be human at some like deep level, and trying to get as close to some words and portraits and models as we can. So thank you both for who you are and what you do, and for joining today.
Yes, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Oh, a random thought. This is a side note, but I was thinking about this men going off by themselves, this Lone Ranger iconography. One really great example actually is the movie The Lion King. Simba leaves his tribe and runs away from his destiny as, the chief and the provider. And when Nala comes and finds him, she's like, how dare you go away and not come back? You can't just be on your own. We don't do that here.
And doesn't she almost like save his life a few times if he is on it? Like it's been like many years since I saw that movie, which genuinely traumatized me when I was about, 11 years old.
It was scary.
When Mufasa died.
He also survives by finding community.
Yes.
When he's in exile.
And then he brings them.
Yeah, he has to find somewhere else. Yeah, I just this MGTOW movement in the manosphere, like the men going their own way thing. I'm just like it is as close to contradiction. I just think like the idea of being your own man is I know what people mean by that. They mean just like, you're going your own way, etc. That you can define. And of course, as a liberal, in the Mill sense, I think there's a lot to that. There's a lot to creating yourself. But the idea that means you are for yourself.
Yeah.
No.
And for yourself primarily only. It's the anthropologically, it's the opposite of masculinity. Absolutely opposite.
Yeah, the telos is emptied out. Yeah. But the coming of age, I mean, you were touching on this earlier, Christine, but like in all sorts of civilizations throughout human history, tribes, like that sort of almost like a bar mitzvah, like the 13 between age 12 and 15, like coming of age moment for men has involved a moment of like kind of violent individuation and suffering through. I mean, I think about like the guys in Indonesia that like, I think still like fall from a cliff with a rope and like, that's all. There is something baked into like the primordial need that is specifically male for some solitary, like death and rebirth almost, I think. So there's something in that. But I agree, you have to come back to something.
There's some transformation, yeah.
We forget that the figure of the Lone Ranger and the cowboy were originally a bit sad. There's something sad about having to be on your own on the range.
Yeah. And it's difficult to find a Western that's not, I mean, you talk about all these movies that are undermining the Western narrative, but it's difficult to find any story that's a Western that doesn't at the same time undermine its own sort of narrative of the Lone Ranger kind of.
Like the searchers. Yeah.
So I want to say a good word for the Western. I think they're more aware of that dynamic often and that criticism than we think they are.
But isn't there something, and I'll speak to what women want and then see if the women agree with my assessment of what women want, which isn't also part of the fantasy on part of women is to sort of get the Lone Ranger and bring him into community, bring him into family, sort of bring him into be the one that sort of snags the guy that's the loner, right, and brings him in. Isn't that part of it too? Isn't that part of the appeal that you can, he's out there on his own, you bring him in?
Now we're talking Beauty and the Beast. Like this
I don't know.
The civilizing influence of a woman.
It's a both.
Yeah, we are talking Beauty and the Beast, but isn't there some part? What's the appeal of the cowboy? Isn't part of the appeal of the cowboy that you could sort of be the one to bring him off the range?
I mean, and I don't know what you're gonna. I don't know.
Is that just me? I don't know. I mean,
with these outtakes here, that's a really interesting question. Yeah. I mean, maybe in some ways they're like kind of two parts to the appeal. I'm just like thinking out loud here. Like one, the individuation aspect of self-mastery. Like there is something about the cowboy where it's like, oh, this is a person who can like take care of themselves and like take care of things and who's like self-sufficient and
they don't need to be taught how to iron.
Yeah. And like that's admirable. Like a doer, somebody who can do stuff. But the idea of bringing someone in is maybe part of it. It's a little bit of a rescuer impulse, but yeah, it's bringing them back into community, and like that's the gift that you can give. I feel like if we think about the sort of romance novel or Beauty and the Beast like ideals, it seems pretty rare that it's like a woman sees a cowboy and is like, I also want to go be a cowboy and we'll both be lonely out there together. It's like the solution is to be the one who like finds the individual who is like who has achieved this sort of self-mastery and this proficiency in many things and makes them of use to her and others.
Brings them into but on the other hand, to continue with our cultural references, that the Man Park sketch in Saturday Night Live, where there's where they have to take the guys to be friends and stuff, is maybe there's almost the opposite challenge, which is that there is women who want the men to have more self mastery, right? They're too They're too relational. And so back to this, is a criticism maybe of my piece, is that if we overdo the relational and embedded thing, we miss the self-mastery thing. And given that we're outtakes that they're going to use to destroy our reputations, this is where we get cancelled, Christine. Right, this is the moment, right? It's actually maybe the issue about self-mastery and kind of discipline and so on that we're getting from that side of masculinity. Maybe, I'll go out on a real limb here, maybe that's because the idea of self-mastery is more important for this sense of mature masculinity than almost of mature femininity. There's more stuff for us guys to master in ourselves, right?
Interesting.
That in terms of like aggression and sex drive and risk-taking, and like there's a lot of stuff that we have to master.
The last time I heard you, Richard, in conversation with Christine some months back, was it you who said, I loved this, masculinity is like nuclear deterrence. It's having strength, but knowing when to restrain it.
That was Christine. That was Christine. Yeah. So if you're going to, that was not me.
That was awesome, but
it was.
Nuclear deterrence, that's what you call a lot of things that need to happen down.
And that was at a private meeting. I just want to say on Christine's behalf.
My experience, I have so much trouble.
I'm like an atom bomb. I'm incredible.
But yeah, so Christine, of course, put the perfect words to it. That it is, don't you think? It's just like we do, like an unself-mastered man is a more dangerous thing in the world than an unself-mastered woman, right? And so there is something more important about male self-mastery. And so you do want him to have done that one way or the other. And if there are institutions, individuations, rituals, trials, learnings, etc., whatever the way is, you go from being this kind of just 12-year-old boy, 10 years later, what is he going to be? The range of options is very wide. And so how we get him to 22 in a good way that's a huge cultural task at which we're failing in various different ways. And some of the guys end up like maybe just completely lost, as in Christine's kind of essay, and backed out, passive, just, doped out, whatever. And then some men act out the other way. So you get the men who check out, the men who act out. But it's not good. And so there's just a range of outcomes. But when we get it right, they're awesome. So when we get men right, they are awesome. But when we get them wrong, they're awful.
That's a bumper sticker.
There you go.
That's your tagline. Our gender season has commenced. We hope you enjoyed this inaugural conversation and will stick around for more. The Whole Person Revolution is a podcast of Comment Magazine, whose mission is to foster imagination for a thriving society. We publish pieces by cultural luminaries and pioneering practitioners. We produce this podcast and another arguably still feistier one called Zealots at the Gate. We equip and convene civic leaders through suppers and other gatherings in real time, and we are stewarding a budding institutional ecosystem animated by the Christian humanist tradition, an ecosystem known as Breaking Ground. Comment readers are society's weavers, community shepherds laboring to hold our social fabric together, and our job in all that we do is to help them help you rehumanize our age, equipping you with frameworks, stories, and exemplars to sustain your vocational joy, refresh your vision, and connect you with one another to effect real cultural change. Consider joining us. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood or attend one of our webinars with an author. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comment.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder.
And I'm Jeff Reimer.
And we'll see you next week.